I've been hunting for over a decade now, ever since my dad handed me my first rifle at 14. There's something peaceful about it. It's not just about the thrill of the chase or bringing down a deer, though I won't lie, that's a big part of it. No, it's the quiet that draws me in. The way the world slows down when you're sitting out there alone with nothing but the wind and the rustling trees. It's the kind of quiet you don't find anywhere else, but sometimes that quiet can turn on you. 5 years ago, I learned that the hard way. It was late October, and I'd taken a few days off work to head out to this spot I'd been going to for years. It wasn't a public hunting ground, nothing official anyway. It was a patch of land a buddy of mine, Dan, had shown me back when we were in our 20s. Dan's uncle owned it, but no one ever used it except us. It was tucked away off a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, a perfect spot if you wanted to hunt without dealing with the crowds. That year, though, Dan couldn't make it. He had his hands full with a newborn, and I understood. Life changes when you've got kids. So I decided to head out on my own. I'd done solo hunts plenty of times before, so it wasn't anything new. I spent most of the first day scouting. The deer hadn't been moving much yet, which wasn't surprising. The weather had been unseasonably warm, and it wasn't until the evenings that you could really feel that autumn chill. That's when the animals start coming out, once the temperature drops. By the second day, I'd found a good spot near the edge of a small valley. The trees formed a natural blind, and I set myself up there, watching the field below. I had my thermos, a sandwich, and plenty of time. I wasn't in any rush. That's the thing about hunting. Patience is key. You can't force nature to move at your pace. It was around dusk when things started to get strange. I had just finished my sandwich and was sipping on some coffee, enjoying the way the shadows lengthened across the valley. The wind had picked up a bit, and the leaves rustled softly, creating that kind of background noise that lulls you into a comfortable state. I was in no hurry. The deer usually start moving after the sun dips below the horizon, so I was content to wait. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. At first I didn't think much of it. Just a pair of eyes reflecting the light, maybe 100 yards out. I figured it was a deer. They're skittish at dusk, and it wasn't unusual to see them poking around before they moved into the open. I leaned forward a bit, trying to get a better look. But something was strange. The eyes were too high off the ground, higher than any deer I'd ever seen. I sat up a little straighter, squinting into the distance. They weren't moving, just watching. I've seen enough deer and coyotes in my life to know what animal eyes look like at night, but these didn't match anything I knew. They weren't the right color, not that bright reflective glow you get from deer. These were dull, almost flat, and the height was all wrong. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light. Maybe it was standing on a small rise or a log. Maybe it was a big buck, and I just couldn't see its body. But the more I stared, the less sense it made. The eyes didn't move, not even a twitch, and that's what got me. I pulled out my binoculars to get a better look. When I raised them to my face, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The eyes blinked, but not like a deer, and not like any animal I've ever seen. They blinked sideways. I locked up. That wasn't right. No animal's eyes blink like that. I lowered the binoculars, rubbing my eyes, convinced I'd just seen it wrong. Maybe it was the low light playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the eyes were still there. I've spent enough time out in the wilderness to know when something's wrong. You get a sense for it. The way the forest goes quiet. The way your instincts start screaming at you to leave. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there, gripping my rifle, staring at those eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when it started moving. At first it was just a slight shift, like it was testing the waters. Then it began to glide toward me, slowly, silently. The eyes grew larger as it approached, but the way it moved, it wasn't natural. There was no noise, no snapping twigs, no rustling leaves. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear, but I knew it wasn't. It was too tall, too silent. My pulse quickened and I tightened my grip on my rifle. What the hell was this thing? I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the approaching figure. The moment I moved, it stopped. Just stopped dead in its tracks, like it was waiting. And the idea of something watching me like that, moving toward me, was enough to send my nerves into overdrive. But I didn't want to run. Not yet. I wasn't sure what would happen if I turned my back on it. I started backing up, one step at a time, never taking my eyes off it. It didn't move. It just stood there. Those eyes still locked on me. I tried to stay calm, my mind running through my options. Do I shoot? Do I run? Do I just wait it out? I didn't have to decide. The moment I took another step back, the eyes blinked again, sideways, and then they disappeared. Just gone. 1 second they were there, the next, the woods were empty. I stood there waiting for them to come back, but they didn't. I don't know how long I stood there. The sky had grown darker, the temperature dropping even more, and I could barely feel my fingers on the rifle. Finally, I decided I'd had enough. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and started making my way back to the truck. The whole walk back, I kept expecting to see those eyes again, peeking out from behind the trees, following me. But they never did. Still, I didn't relax. My senses were on high alert, every snap of a twig making me jump. By the time I reached my truck, the sun had completely set, and the woods were pitch black. I loaded up my gear as fast as I could, threw it in the back, and got the hell out of there. The drive home was quiet. The whole time, I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something running behind me, those sideways blinking eyes shining in the dark. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I parked, grabbed my gear, and headed inside, locking the door behind me. For the first time in years, I didn't look forward to going back out hunting. I spent the next few days trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe it was an animal I'd never seen before. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew that whatever was out there wasn't anything natural. I haven't been back to that spot since. I've thought about it, but something always stops me. Dan's asked a few times why we don't go there anymore, and I just shrug, telling him the deer population's better elsewhere. He doesn't push it, but I can tell he's curious. Maybe one day I'll tell him about the eyes, but for now, I'm keeping it to myself. Because the truth is, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to remember those eyes, blinking sideways in the dark. And I sure as hell don't want to know what they belong to. I'd been hunting solo in these remote mountains for 3 days when the storm hit. It came fast, like it had been lurking just over the ridge, waiting for the perfect moment to roll in. The air had been cool all afternoon, the kind that puts a shiver in your spine without much effort. And then, out of nowhere, the wind picked up. Clouds gathered like a mass of dark bruises across the sky. I've hunted long enough to know when it's time to head back to camp, but I was miles from my base. The woods had gone strangely quiet, no scurrying of squirrels or birds calling from the trees. It's funny how you don't notice those sounds until they're gone. I picked up my pace, heading toward an old trail I remembered that should have led me to some kind of shelter. I'd been in these mountains before, but even then, I wasn't entirely sure where the trail would take me, just that I couldn't be stuck out there when the rain started. After about an hour of walking, I saw a small cabin tucked between the trees, almost camouflaged by the thick undergrowth. The roof sagged, and the wood looked like it had seen better days, but it was shelter. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, I didn't have the luxury of being picky. I made it to the cabin just as the downpour started. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, and the wind picked up, shaking the trees like they were nothing more than blades of grass. I was soaked through by the time I reached the door, which was slightly ajar. It creaked when I pushed it open, revealing a small, dusty room with a stove in one corner, and a single chair propped up against the wall. The cabin wasn't much, but it was dry, and right then, that was all I cared about. I dropped my pack on the floor, peeled off my wet jacket, and gave the place a once-over. It was bare, just the stove, a table with a few chairs, and a small stack of firewood in the corner. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, like whoever had been there before me had just walked out and never came back. There was something about the air in that cabin, though. It smelled of old wood and damp earth, like the place hadn't been disturbed in years. I checked the wood by the door. It was fresh, recently chopped. That was odd. I didn't think anyone lived around these parts, at least not full-time, but I figured maybe another hunter or a hiker had taken refuge there before me. As the rain pounded against the roof, I busied myself setting up a small fire in the stove. The warmth spread quickly through the cabin. I had this unsettling feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, but it was better than being out in the storm. No harm in borrowing a bit of warmth and shelter for the night. By the time I had dried off a little and settled in, the storm was in full swing. Rain hammered against the roof, and the wind howled through the trees like some kind of wild animal. I sat by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside, feeling thankful that I wasn't caught in it. But even as I warmed my hands by the stove, a gnawing unease settled in my gut. I looked around the cabin again, my eyes catching on the pot that sat on the stove. It was covered in a layer of dust, but there were faint scorch marks on the bottom like it had been used recently. I hadn't noticed those before. I thought back to the chopped wood by the door, how fresh it had looked. Someone had been here recently. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just another traveler like me, maybe passing through and leaving things behind. The mountains were unpredictable, and it wasn't strange to run into signs of others, even if you didn't see them directly. I told myself that 100 times, but that creeping sensation in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. Night had fallen, the only light now coming from the dying fire in the stove. I figured I'd try to get some sleep, so I spread out my sleeping bag on the floor near the stove, where it was still warm. The wind howled outside, and the rain continued to pour, and I had just started to drift off when I heard the door creaking open. I shot upright, my heart slamming in my chest. The door was open, just an inch or two, like someone had pushed it. I stared at it. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and there was no reason the door should have moved on its own. I checked the lock. I was sure of it. I got up, moving quietly toward the door, my hand reaching for the handle of the hunting knife at my side. I pulled the door open wider, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. The woods beyond the cabin were dark and still, the storm having subsided into a steady drizzle. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The trees were silent. No animals, no people, just the dripping of rain from the leaves. I backed into the cabin, my hand still on the knife, and shut the door, this time making sure it was bolted. I double-checked the windows too, ensuring they were secure, before settling back down by the fire. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Time dragged on, and with every little sound, every creak or gust of wind, I couldn't help but think about that door, how it had opened on its own, how it felt like someone had been standing there, just outside. I must have dozed off again, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a soft noise outside. It was barely audible over the rain, but it was there, a steady scraping like something was being dragged along the ground. I grabbed my rifle this time and moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. Peeking through the glass, I saw nothing but darkness. The scraping continued, and then it stopped. I waited, heart thudding in my chest, my eyes fixed on the door. Nothing. No footsteps. No sound. I stood frozen, rifle in hand, straining to hear anything that would give me a clue as to what was going on. And then, the sound started again. This time, closer to the cabin. I stepped back from the window, my pulse quickening. Someone was out there. I was sure of it now. I didn't know if they meant harm, but the thought of someone sneaking around outside in the middle of the night, during a storm, sent a chill through me. I stood there listening. And then, the noise stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. No knock on the door, no footsteps retreating into the woods, just silence. Finally, the sky began to lighten as dawn approached. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp, gray morning. I packed up my gear, ready to get the hell out of there. I wasn't about to stick around and see who or what had been lurking around the cabin. As I stepped outside, something caught my eye. A fresh pile of wood, neatly stacked by the door. The logs were freshly cut, the bark still wet from the rain. I stood there, staring at the pile. I hadn't chopped that wood. And yet, there it was, like some kind of offering, left by an unseen hand. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but there was no one there. Just the silent woods, stretching out endlessly in every direction. I didn't waste any more time. I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, my rifle in hand, the uneasy feeling never leaving me. The whole way back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been watching me that night, had been there in the cabin with me, just out of sight. And when I got back to my truck, I found something that chilled me to the core. There, on the hood, was a single, freshly chopped log, perfectly placed like a reminder. A reminder that I hadn't been alone. There's something about the quiet isolation of the woods that I've always loved. It's one of those places where you can disconnect completely, far from the noise of everyday life. That's why I hunted, not for the kill, but for the solitude. Just me, the trees, and the open air. This trip was supposed to be like all the others, a peaceful weekend escape into the wilderness, my rifle slung over my shoulder, and nothing but the sounds of nature to keep me company. The spot I'd chosen was deep in the forest, far from any trails or established campsites. It was a place I'd stumbled upon years ago, a secluded clearing that felt like it was mine and mine alone. I'd never seen another hunter out there, which was exactly why I kept coming back. The more remote, the better. No distractions, no people, just the wild. I arrived late afternoon, the sky already starting to burn orange as the sun dipped behind the trees. After parking the truck at the edge of an old dirt road, I grabbed my gear and headed into the woods. It was about a half-mile walk to the clearing, but the path was well worn from my previous trips. I could have found it in the dark if I needed to. The forest was alive with the sounds of evening, birds calling to each other, the rustle of leaves in the wind. The air was cool, crisp, perfect for a late fall hunt. The season was turning, and you could feel winter waiting just around the corner. I reached the clearing as the last light of day was fading, and I quickly set up camp. Tent, fire, the usual routine. As soon as the fire was roaring and the tent was up, I felt that familiar sense of peace settle over me. There's nothing like sitting by a campfire in the middle of nowhere, staring up at the stars with nothing but your own thoughts to keep you company. The worries of work, bills, and everyday life felt far away, like they belonged to someone else. After cooking up some dinner, just a can of beans and some coffee to wash it down, I leaned back against my pack and watched the fire flicker. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that only the woods can offer. Every once in a while the wind would rustle through the branches, or a bird would call in the distance, but mostly it was just me and the fire. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of something faint. At first I thought it was part of a dream, soft, distant, like a lullaby being carried on the wind. But as I sat up and rubbed my eyes, I realized it wasn't a dream. There was singing out there in the woods. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, and listened. It was faint, but it was there. Someone was singing. A man's voice, I thought, though it was hard to tell. The melody was strange, disjointed, like he was making it up as he went along. I looked around the clearing, but the fire had burned down to embers. The sky above was a deep navy, with just a few stars twinkling between the clouds. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, but there was no sign of anyone. The singing continued, soft and steady, and a knot of unease started to form in my gut. I'd been coming to this spot for years, and I'd never seen anyone else out here. It was too far off the beaten path, too remote for casual campers or hikers. So who the hell was out there? I stood up, brushing the dirt off my pants, and grabbed my rifle, just in case. I wasn't one to spook easily, but something about this felt wrong. Singing in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, it didn't sit right with me. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness as I took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. The trees stood tall and silent, but the singing? It was closer now. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The singing stopped. Just like that, it was gone. No gradual fade, no footsteps retreating into the night. It just stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I waited, tense, rifle at the ready, but nothing happened. No movement, no sound, just the crackle of the dying fire behind me and the wind in the trees. I shook my head and turned back toward the fire. Maybe it had been a hunter, passing through on his way to a different spot. Or maybe it was just my imagination, the result of too much solitude and not enough sleep. Either way, there didn't seem to be any immediate danger. I sat back down by the fire, stoking it until the flames were dancing again, and tried to shake off the lingering unease. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't on edge, though. The woods at night are a different beast than they are during the day. I've always been a fan of hunting, ever since my dad first took me out when I was just a kid. But last fall, something happened that made me question whether I'll ever feel safe out there again. It was mid-October, when my friend Greg and I decided to spend the weekend hunting in a canyon about an hour's drive from town. Greg had heard from a few guys at work that it was the perfect spot, remote, with plenty of deer roaming the area. The idea of getting away from everything sounded perfect. Plus, the canyon had this reputation for being quiet. Too quiet, if you ask some people. But we didn't care. We were ready for a break from the noise of our lives, and that place seemed perfect. We left early on a Saturday morning, our truck packed with camping gear, rifles, and enough food to last a few days. On the drive out there, we stopped once for gas, and once more to stretch our legs before arriving at the canyon. Now, this wasn't just any canyon. It was a massive, sprawling place, with steep, jagged cliffs on either side, and a dense forest at the bottom. We parked the truck near the edge and hiked down into the woods, the trail winding like a snake between the cliffs. The descent was steep, but the further we got, the more peaceful it became. The air was cool, and the sound of birds chirping filled the space between the trees. As we walked deeper into the forest, something strange started to happen. The usual sounds of the woods seemed to fade. It wasn't sudden, but gradual, like someone was turning down the volume. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, it was dead silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the sound of our own footsteps and the occasional crunch of twigs underfoot. "Man, it's quiet out here," Greg said, breaking the silence. "Yeah, peaceful though," I said, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping up my back. We set up camp in the clearing, with a small fire pit in the center and our tents a few feet apart. It was late afternoon by the time we finished, and we decided to explore the area a bit before settling down for the night. We grabbed our rifles and set off into the woods, moving slowly and keeping an eye out for any signs of deer. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just this nagging sense of unease. "You notice how weird it is?" Greg asked after a while, keeping his voice low. "Yeah, no animals, no nothing. Feels like we're the only ones out here." Greg nodded, looking around. "Maybe they've moved further up the canyon. We'll get something tomorrow." We kept walking, but after about an hour, it became clear we weren't going to see any game that day. We turned around and headed back to camp as the sun began to set. Back at the clearing, we built a fire, and for a while it felt normal. We cooked some dinner, had a few beers, and talked about everything but the strange quiet around us. The fire crackled, and the warmth of it pushed away the cold night air. But just as I started to relax, I heard something. An echo. A low, far-off sound reverberated through the canyon, bouncing off the walls and repeating itself over and over. It wasn't the kind of echo you'd expect to hear out there. It didn't follow our voices or the sound of the fire. It was its own thing, unnatural. Greg must have heard it too, because he stopped mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" I stopped, listening closely. There it was again, a low, drawn-out echo, almost like a voice, but too distorted to make out any words. We both stood up, scanning the trees around us. The echo came again, this time louder, closer. "What the hell is that?" Greg whispered. "I don't know. Maybe the wind," I offered, though I didn't believe it for a second. We stood there for a few minutes, but the sound didn't come back. The fire crackled, and the night seemed to settle back into its strange, heavy silence. Greg shrugged and sat back down by the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, after we'd crawled into our tents, I lay awake, listening. The silence was suffocating. No crickets, no wind, just nothing. I closed my eyes, trying to drift off, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every little noise sounded amplified in the stillness, and then I heard it again. The echo. Now it sounded like it was coming from just outside my tent, like someone was moving through the trees, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls and surrounding us. My heart started to pound in my chest, and I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on. I sat up and pointed the beam of light at the entrance to my tent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the same eerie quiet. But then, the echo came again, and this time it was followed by a distinct rustling sound, like footsteps in the underbrush. "Greg," I whispered, but there was no response. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting this dim glow across the clearing. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but the sound was still there, echoing through the canyon. I crawled out of the tent and stood up, scanning the trees with my flashlight. But it didn't reveal anything, just trees and shadows. But the sound was closer now, louder, like it was circling us. I backed toward Greg's tent and gave it a light kick. "Hey, wake up!" Greg groaned from inside, and after a moment his head popped out. "What is it?" "Listen," I whispered, pointing toward the trees. Greg frowned, his face scrunched in confusion. Then he heard it too, the echo. And now, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the trees. It was a voice, low, distorted, and impossible to understand. It echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing around us, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "What the hell is that?" Greg whispered. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." We quickly grabbed our rifles and what little gear we could carry and started moving toward the trail. The echo followed us, like whatever was making the sound was getting closer. We moved fast, almost running, but the trail was steep and treacherous in the dark. Our flashlights barely cut through the blackness, and every now and then, one of us would stumble over a rock or tree root, but we didn't stop. The echo stayed with us the whole way, growing louder and more distorted. It was like a chorus of voices now, overlapping and blending together into one awful grating sound. By the time we reached the truck, we were both out of breath, our nerves shot. We threw our gear into the back and jumped inside, slamming the doors shut. Greg fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. Finally it started, and we peeled out of there, the echo fading behind us as we sped down the dirt road. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back on the main road, where the trees thinned out and the night seemed a little less oppressive. Greg finally pulled over, and we sat there in silence for a long time, just trying to process what had happened. "What the hell was that?" Greg finally asked. "I don't know, man. I really don't." We didn't talk much after that. The drive back to town was quiet, and by the time we got home, it was almost morning. Neither of us ever went back to that canyon. We never even talked about it again, not really. If these stories gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next terrifying tales. Did you think these stories were creepy? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear from you. And remember, the wilderness isn't always what it seems. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.